September, which of course is the opportunity for week in review and outlook. And given that it's the first Sunday, we've had the pleasure of welcoming Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia, back to the table after the summer. It's also sort of somewhat a summer review, Mike. I'd welcome your thoughts of how we've got to where we are in this first week in September. I say to you that we've now gone sort of up the mountain of the Ukraine war premium, and we're back to where we were the days before mid-February, $93 on Brent. Your sense of where the market's at now, can we say we have the war premium is now out of the price?
No, Sean, absolutely not. But I think we'll fill the half hour with the last week's events. If we go back to February, we're going to need to be here until tomorrow. Yes, we did see some major price corrections, but there are many other factors other than Ukraine in force here. If you just recap what happened last week, oil sold off about 11% on the week, starting with a rally on Monday, actually, to then selling off $10 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and another $3 on Thursday before stabilizing on Friday at 93, with WTI in the 80s. That indeed, in the context of recent prices, doesn't feel like a war premium number, but of course, it's still a plenty high price. But all the attention was on European gas, as it has been for the last months, because of the Russia-Ukraine backdrop, of course, and the correction there was about 38%. So we saw an all-time high, matching the spike we saw on the invasion itself, of around 340 something euros, and that's now sitting at 212. That's a massive correction, and I think it warrants a little bit further analysis into what happened. But back to oil, I mean, we had a confluence of other factors. I mean, we have continued weak data coming out of China, be it the industrial productivity in the factory space, or be it COVID-related lockdowns. It's certainly the only country in the world that still measures asymptomatic cases. Here in Singapore, the masks came off exactly a week ago. They're now optional in all spaces, but undergrounds and buses and airports and hospitals. But the strong dollar, the easing of the flare-up on Tuesday in Iraq, where we had a one-day spate of violence that caused concerns over supply because there was some misinformation floating around about invasion of oil production facilities, and the overall weaker macro picture, including this cost of living crisis we keep talking about, just biting and hitting home harder, and particularly in Europe, where the rhetoric in the media started talking about a terrible winter, at the very same time that the specialist markets, people like us partaking in oil and gas supply and demand analysis, started concluding that maybe, just maybe, Europe can get by if the winter is mild and if some form of rationing were to happen on the gas. So all that gave us a slightly weaker picture, but I do think there's a lot of macro concern in there in terms of impact on the economy and recessionary fears. But Sean, I can keep talking. So
that's a good start. Last week, let's welcome John Defterios, Professor of Business, NYU Abu Dhabi, and World Economic Forum Energy Fellow, sitting in Milan this morning. John, about to take a leading role in gas tech yourself, which we'll get to. But I'd welcome your thoughts. Mike took last week. You take us the week before, which of course oil prices went up $10 because of the commentary by the Saudi oil minister, indicating that output cuts could be on the cards. And so as a curtain raiser ahead of OPEC Plus meeting tomorrow, what do you think is front and center for their considerations?
Well, it's a great point, and I agree with everything that Mike had to say, but let's look at the curtain raiser to OPEC Plus. You know, the Saudis, specialize in looking at the data, Sean, as you well know. And they're worried about what you saw in China that Mike flagged here about industrial activity dropping for the first time in a quarter. They saw the job figures come out Friday in the United States, 315,000 jobs, still pretty strong, although the wage rises are starting to ease here, but 3.7% unemployment rate. So to Mike's point here, I think we're going to have a division of the OECD countries, if you will, where Europe is slowing down heavily because of the Russia gas crisis and actually shutting down Nord Stream 1. This is the major news out of the weekend. And then the confrontation with the G7 saying they're going to try to enforce a price cap. If you're not buying the oil in the open market, can you enforce a price cap? No. Does it make it a better purchasing price for the developing world and players like India? Yes. So this is that equilibrium playing out right now. So let's see what OPEC Plus tries to do here. They're saying the oversupply is about 400,000 barrels a day. They thought it was even higher before. So the kind of demand is holding up at this stage. But they're saying, let's fast forward to 2023, and then you can make parallels to the financial crisis when we had oil prices go to $147 a barrel and then collapse. They don't want to see a repeat. So my view coming into that OPEC Plus meeting is they want to defend $90 to $95 a barrel. You know, they don't target prices, but the actions, the language are certainly indicating that. Do they make a move to cut at this stage? I would say it's surprising, partially because of geopolitical reasons right now. Don't forget, Joe Biden went to go see Mohammed bin Salman and Abdulaziz bin Salman and saying, can you collaborate with us? But they have to kind of toe the line here in the middle. They don't want to take sides, don't want to overreact to a slowdown that hasn't really appeared just yet. But the message was, we're monitoring the situation. If we need to pull oil off the market, we'll do so. I remember being at the meeting when COVID-19 was just starting to percolate, and the Saudis wanted to cut 1.5 million barrels a day, and the Russians wanted to stick at 800,000 barrels a day. Even 1.5, as we learned, wasn't enough, but the Saudis were ahead of the curve because of the data they were looking at, Sean. So I think they're going to be very cautious here, to be with their hands on the tiller, and if they need to move, they will shift and cut if necessary. I just don't think so yet.
Well, Mike, I welcome your thoughts on that, because that's why I asked you if the Ukraine premium is gone or not gone, because the real question now, to understand, is how tight is this market in which OPEC will be assessing? You mentioned a lot of bearish sentiment there, weak China, etc. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, is 93 on a downward dropping knife, or is it solid? Is it consolidating?
It's tough to say, Sean, but in terms of price action and market talk and money inflows and outflows that we observe, the market is generally in a risk-off mindset because of summer blues, because many companies have or seem to have or claim to have made their targets on the year and therefore are in a risk-off mood. So this adds to the potent cocktail of volatility, because a lot of players are on the sidelines, not least because of summer holiday with Labor Day in the US. That's going to be another thin day tomorrow, Monday. I would suspect that a lot of people who had length would have gotten rid of it on that price down move $10 ago, and the market is therefore not seeing the same sort of open interest, which again is an item that was lamented by Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman in his comments about a week ago, expressing concern that the market is not necessarily reflecting fundamentals, but reflecting lack of liquidity and money flows. But the one other thing I think that OPEC Plus will need to take into account tomorrow is Iran, where over the course of the last 10 days or so, there's been a complete flip-flop in public sentiment over will there be a deal, where I think 5-6 days ago, the answer was a resounding yes, it looks like it, to now it's in the long grass again and it's somewhere in the future. And that matters. It absolutely matters as we come into the peak demand period for Asia in particular. And in terms of APEC conference and then the October period, where in Asia, large NOCs tend to sign up term contracts for the next calendar year. The whole mindset around will there or will there not be Iranian oil in the market is extremely important for OPEC Plus to take into account. I keep saying this every time I come on this forum, Sean, but the range of expectations by the experts out there on how these things will play out has never been broader. You can drive multiple buses through the high and the low end of the range of expectations.
Well, I mean, on the range of expectations, Mike, the Saudi oil minister did bring in one of them and punctuated the idea of a cut, which one would have really not put in that range, I think, this soon. That was an added piece of the puzzle. How do you digest that? A survey's indicating, a survey done over the weekend, 46% expecting a cut. Your thoughts, is it too soon? Does OPEC need to hold their fire to when it really could have impact?
I think what we need to bear in mind is that people do worry about spare capacity, and not just geopolitical disruptions, but also weather disruptions, and of course the entire sanctions picture. So I guess we'll come back to price caps in Russia in a while, but I think on the gas, the TTF, the market has had a very clear demonstration of what happens to price when there's a concern about capacity and effectively a rationing mindset. I mean, that explosive move in TTF up to 343 euros per megawatt hour is something obviously we haven't seen in oil, but we have to bear in mind that in oil, there is less oil in the US SPR. That's at something like 20, 30-year lows after the interventionist measures that were enacted by the Biden administration, with a whole bunch of other countries acting in concert with that. And at the same time, the period of price stabilization after COVID by OPEC Plus is also over, and there's a big question mark over the what next. So by expressing a willingness to take oil off the market in response to either oil coming into the market from Iran sanctions being dropped, or from lack of demand in China due to COVID repression measures, it just serves as a reminder that we're not going to see everybody producing flat out. And therefore, I think we do need to bear in mind that there needs to be a risk premium for the lack of spare capacity in oil markets.
Yeah, that does seem to be happening. John, let's go into the point on gas. You mentioned it, obviously massive headline, the closure of Nord Stream 1. You have to imagine that's it, gas off for the winter now. Not only a massive geopolitical moment, but just on pure gas. You're sitting on the start of Gastech there. I'm sure it's going to dominate everything. How big a moment is it? What is it going to do? Where are solutions coming from? Is it the game changer, the next lever? How do you see it?
Well, number one, let's look at the near term. Look at the U.S. cargoes. I saw your S&P report there, Sean. If you look at the market, the European market right now is amply supplied, and they're trying to store up for the winter. This is a major issue. Mike brought up this idea of, what's the narrative coming out of Europe? As you know, I'm living in the UK. We're seeing a huge spike in inflation, but the average housing bill is going to be about £4,500 to £5,000 per year. It's extraordinary, and it's biting severely. And we have a leadership change coming up also in 24 hours as well, probably to Liz Truss. So the narrative in Europe is one of great concern about inflation right now, rising inflation because of energy prices. OPEC Plus has the meeting. What's going to be the next move? I don't think it's going to be a cut right now. And if you look at the gas supplies, we're okay because they're being prudent, trying to cut demand, trying to store for the future. And then Vladimir Putin comes and says, I'm going to turn off the faucet here on Nord Stream 1. And we have to remember, because of the sanctions, Nord Stream 2 is not coming to the market as well. But the U.S. is ready to fill the void, but can it do so for the winter? The answer is no. And it's amazing to see this level of disruption. The G7 trying to make a power play to shut off the pricing mechanisms for Russian crude into the market. We see that spike down because of the concerns about demand in gas prices in the first quarter of 2023. I think, in fact, the market's going into a slight lull right now because the pressure here, the mood here is that there's great concerns for the winter. So what does it mean for Gastech, Sean? There's no, silver bullet, of course, but for the first time at Gastech, there's a great focus on the Eastern Mediterranean. I would say we didn't do the planning that was necessary over the last decade. We got lulled into thinking that as a member of the G8, Russia would be supplying Europe for decades to come. Germany has that dependence. They have the special relationship when it comes to industrial gas supplies and oil supplies into Europe as well. That's all been thrown out the door because of what we see in Ukraine. This is the obvious. But what is Germany trying to do? They're trying to save for a rainy day. We know that the Eastern European states are much more vulnerable to the gas supplies coming from Russia. So that's a key concern. We have a Turkish deputy minister, the minister from Cyprus, the minister from Greece, the petroleum minister, Tarek El-Molla, coming from Egypt. There's going to be a lot of sidebar meetings, and I've been invited to a few of them to look at the Eastern Mediterranean, even the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy coming from the United States. That's going to be the behind-the-scenes discussion. Can you get a simple solution? No, but they need to establish Turkey with Greece and Cyprus on the maritime boundaries, so this does not provide a bottleneck. And then you have the geopolitics at play here too, Sean. Erdogan
that's
visiting
not
Russia.
An uncomplicated neighborhood, is it?
It's not an uncomplicated neighborhood. You also think about the president of Turkey and Vladimir Putin and him trying to serve as the broker here between Russia and Ukraine. Does he step out into the Mediterranean and say, yes, I do want a deal as well, and I want to be part of it? I don't see that happening very quickly. If it's okay with you, I think I should also address Iran and the language that we heard over the weekend. A constructive response was from the foreign ministry of Iran. That's how they played it. And then U.S. sources were telling Politico overnight that I think we've taken a huge step backwards. So people don't think a deal is on the table. Having visited Iran 3 times, you know, my coverage at OPEC through the years, Sean, I don't think we should count this out. I just think Iran's at the bargaining table, and we know how tough they are at the bargaining table. I think they want to get the best deal possible. But again, geopolitics come into play here because it's Iran, India, Russia, Turkey, China. This is kind of the new bloc with India trying to sit on the table here and straddle both sides. Iran's in that position as well. Do they move to get a nuclear deal so they can get oil back on the market? And with 18% of global proven gas reserves, the Iranians could play a huge game in the medium term to solve the problem and counterbalance Russia. Saudi Arabia wouldn't be happy with it. So this is where the geopolitics get very complicated.
It is. It's sort of the boy who cried wolf in Iran at this stage. Mike, I wanted to get your thoughts on this oil price cap that the G7 have, I would say they've signed on to, but not, and it's not anywhere near initiated yet. Obviously, there's all these mechanisms that have to be brought into place. But your immediate sense of, is it market relevant yet? When will it become so? Or is it a distortion for the market finding a fair price? What are your thoughts on this mechanism, Mike?
It's probably the most discussed topic in the last 24 hours on social media or specialist online media. And it's awfully hard to say, Sean. The industry has obviously been aware of this desire to put in place such a cap for the last month and a bit, and has largely dismissed the possibility of doing so in a way that actually works. I think we have to bear in mind that Russia's production is a much larger number than Iran's production. So you can't draw parallels about sanctions taking effect in Russia in the same way as Iran, because Russia has the capability to produce 11 million barrels a day of oil. That's 11% of global supply. And its exports at 7+ million barrels a day of crude oil and products combined are an even greater percentage of the global supply picture. It is impossible, let me repeat, it is impossible for the world to get by without all of that. Yes. And if you look at what's happening with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, there have been moments, days, weeks where all the Russian supply has been shut off to certain countries for various technical and I would argue political reasons. So a way must be found to allow Russian oil to continue to flow into markets, because unlike the inventory build of gas in Europe, and people saying they might just get by with rationing, austerity measures, and hopefully a milder winter than last year, that does not apply to oil. It's impossible for the world to get by with not having 7% of 7.5 million barrels a day of exports. So what a price cap might seek to accomplish is that the Russian oil goes to a larger number of markets under a framework that is actually more fungible. In so doing, of course, the 1, 2, 3, 4 markets where most Russian crude oil is flowing now, or will flow once the sanctions take further effect later this year, will be spread out more widely. So therefore, the discounts we're currently seeing in place for Russian crude oil and product exports will possibly diminish at the same time that more participants are brought into the fold. But I haven't in my own mind yet figured out how the price cap will actually be enforced. There is talk, of course, of exerting pressure on those pieces of the supply chain where the G7 that are driving this have a certain degree of control, such as shipping and insurance. And I guess those are the levers that need to be further understood.
The Russian government responded by saying any country that adopted this would be not supplied with Russian oil. In the sense that threat there, obviously, and we're seeing what's happened with gas, and one would have to assume at some point the Russian government isn't going to wait for the Europeans to cut off the oil. They'll probably cut it off before that. I don't know. It would seem if they're going to use it as a weapon, why would they wait? And also the idea that OPEC could cut at any minute. When you have those two, as you said, 10% of the world's supply each, how can oil drop any further when we're one announcement away from a sizable geopolitical action that could really disrupt supply?
You've tried 3 times now, Sean, to get me to say that $93 Brent is cheap.
Well, I'm wondering how vulnerable is $93 oil? How defendable is it from the OPEC perspective?
The range of supply and demand estimates is all over the show, as I said earlier, and therefore there are people that think there's plenty of supply, and there are others who think that it's looking very tight. So, Sean, take your pick.
Take your pick at this moment in time. Well, let's go to the survey question and give the room a chance to take their pick on: does OPEC Plus need to agree? Does OPEC Plus need to agree a supply cut at the meeting tomorrow to stop Brent dropping below $90 in September? Does OPEC need to preemptive? They have in the past tried to react, and always it's kind of been too late, quite often when there's a serious downward draft on the price. But the question that we'll be posting today ahead of the OPEC meeting tomorrow: does OPEC need to agree a supply cut at meeting tomorrow to stop Brent dropping below $90 a barrel in September? John, on the OPEC Plus piece, obviously you've covered it for many, many years. It does seem that so far in the 6 months of the Ukraine war, they've been managed to stay away from the geopolitical challenge because prices have been rising, everybody's making lots of money. And now if you go into a downward trend on the price structure and the need to cut and so forth, and the war itself, the preservation of OPEC Plus is front and center for the group. I'm just wondering your outlook for the cohesion of OPEC Plus to stay together as they go what may be into a cutting arrangement rather than an increasing one.
I don't see the cutting arrangement. I think this meeting that we're going to see tomorrow is going to be done through language and from His Royal Highness Abdulaziz bin Salman. So he can manage that by saying, if needed, we'll be prepared to cut. And as you know, Sean, he said in this world of virtual meetings, we can do so within 24 hours. I need to wait for another meeting. The United States tried to put a wedge between Saudi Arabia and Russia when it comes to OPEC Plus and say to suspend them from the group after the 4 years to build this. They didn't want Humpty Dumpty to crack again. So they clearly, on the geopolitical front, want to keep the OPEC Plus apparatus in place, in store, to be able to respond to the challenges that are coming to the fore. It really depends on winter demand, and the doom and gloom in Europe is what I have to say when it comes to whether to cut now or not. They have to wait to see how severe the downturn will be. I think that's what Saudi Arabia is looking for in the United States. The job numbers remain strong. The growth in the United States remains relatively strong. And I think also people lost perspective when it comes to the interest rate scenario around the world. Yes, interest rates are going up. Yes, they need to tackle inflation. But as a teenager in the 1970s, when Paul Volcker came in my last year of secondary school or high school, and they raised interest rates, to 18, 20%, and that was a response in Europe as well. We're not in the same scenario. We're looking at an interest rate peak at 4%. They can't jack up interest rates in the UK and Europe at a very spiked level because of the very slow growth that's in the pipeline and because they have an energy squeeze right now. So it is a very delicate balancing act. So to keep the cohesion in OPEC Plus, they need to come together and say, what's in the pipeline in the winter months? It's going to be a severe winter where demand's going to peak up. I cannot see cutting ahead of that right now. Well, I don't think it works geopolitically or economically. Sorry.
Whether it's a cut or not, John, they do have to find some new agreement, arrange structure, because the current one is expiring. So whatever it looks like, they've got to find a new agreement. And at the moment, they have a structure that is, I think, fractured by the fact that they're 2 to 3 million barrels below their quota level. And to find any new agreement that has meaning, that is credible, that gap is going to have to be dealt with in some way.
Yeah, well, as Mike was saying, it's not easy to solve a capacity issue overnight. I mean, the giant elephant in the room in our conversation here, you're saying you have an agreement that's expiring, which is absolutely true. So they have to nuance the language. But who has the spare capacity right now? It's Saudi Arabia. the UAE and Kuwait. And that's why the United States with the Europeans are working kind of aggressively behind the scenes to see if they can work out a deal with Iran. I think Iran's playing hardball, trying to get the best deal possible right now, and also trying to counterbalance the influences of Russia and the relations they have there. And then you have players like India that are just in the market trying to look for the best price, a purchaser of Iranian crude, a purchaser of Russian crude at a better price. So it is a huge challenge for OPEC Plus. But every time we count OPEC out of the mix, whether it's the current Minister of Energy, Abdulaziz bin Salman, who's been, as you know, Sean, for 25 years in OPEC, he knows exactly what he's doing. His predecessor, Khalid al-Falih, Ali Naimi, they always come out with an agreement that still sticks. It's more complicated now because you have the broader apparatus of OPEC Plus. So they have to find the nuance, but they don't need to overreact when you do not know how growth is going to hold up, particularly in Europe. I can't overstate this. The mood in Europe economically right now is one that's very dire, with high inflation, very high energy prices, and food prices, to be candid, that have gone up 30 to 40% since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We already had problems coming out of the pandemic with the shortage of supplies and the supply chains really broken. That hasn't changed, and you've added a little layer of uncertainty and inflation that's biting in the pocketbooks right now.
Let's just wrap up around China, Mike. You mentioned China in your earlier comments. I want to, because obviously you just got the fairly negative sense of where Europe's at. I want to get, Mike, your sense of where is China at from your perception? Obviously, the zero COVID policy is kind of the front and center of China's challenge at the moment economically. But it does seem increasingly that their challenges are multipolar beyond the zero COVID. With the Communist Party meeting coming up in a matter of weeks now, what do you see beyond that in terms of where some of these trends might go in China?
So much to say in so little time, Sean. The 16th of October indeed has come as a bit of a relief. So we now know when that Congress is taking place, and everyone expects some degree of opening up of the travel restrictions that have seen the world bereft of the Chinese tourist and the Chinese businessman, which is so important out here in Asia. I talked about the COVID-related lockdowns and the industrial productivity concerns, but the biggest underpinning, I think, of the narrative at Gastech in Milan is going to be the fact that China has imported, or is heading for an annual total for 2022 of importing 19% less LNG than it did in the prior year. Now, we mustn't forget that the 2021 actual was a big increase of similar proportions on 2020, but nonetheless, that has come as a surprise and is just symptomatic of what's happening across Asia, which is demand destruction and fuel switching. LNG has been at the equivalent of a notional $80-something per MMBTU, which to most Asian economies is unaffordable. So what do? They switch or they abstain. In the case of those that can switch, they're burning a lot more coal. And that's been a serious factor in the market, where this volatility in high price market has brought all the energy commodities together in a way that they haven't been connected in the past. But the abstention, the demand destruction mustn't be underestimated also. In some South Asian economies, they simply don't want to buy. And I don't think there has been a fixed price LNG trade out in Asia at more than $60 per MMBTU, when for a number of days it's been trading at 70, 80 something. So that's telling you that various countries are washing their hands of it, burning more coal or reducing industrial output. So it's not just Germany, France, etc., where high energy intense factories are idle, and people are lamenting the fact that industry is uncompetitive. It's happening across Asia also. Now for China, the hope and my constant input into this meeting, as I'm more of a China bull than most, is that things will get better and demand will improve. But right now the headlines are going the other way, with 10 plus million people locked down in various parts of China. The epicenter of COVID seems to be Shenzhen, just the hinterland of Hong Kong, the great tech megalopolis, if you like. So that is weighing on sentiment for sure.
Just to wrap on that a little more, Mike, the sort of behind the COVID curtain, there is the big transformation of China from the industrial sort of construction industry of the last 30 years, and now transitioning towards the higher value, the technology, etc. That change in the structure of the Chinese economy, one very energy intensive. The one they're trying to transition to is less energy intensive. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, in that change, where do you think we are? And coming out of this cycle that China's in, will we drift lower rather than higher in that sort of energy consumption, energy intensive economy?
Many forces here. I mean, as people know, the demographic of China, thanks to the one-child policy, is not a rampant growth in the population, but there is a rampant growth in the affluence in the economy and the growth of the middle classes and their consumption patterns. So I think you are going to see headlines dominated by the ever-present, ever-grander story, and the fact that it was the Chinese construction sector, which is energy intensive, of course, cement, etc., which weighed down on all the indices we're looking at. But that's the very sector the government is now looking to boost and bolster with their very formidable reserves. So I think they're taking steps to counter that, and I look forward to seeing evidence of greater outputs in indices like cement and asphalt and paving, road building, etc., where China still has some way to go in certain provinces that haven't yet seen the huge wave of investment, where literally in the last 2 decades, they've built a highway system equivalent of the interstates in the USA, crisscrossing various affluent provinces. So I think there's some running room left to go in China.
Okay, let's give John the last word with the survey question result on that. So they will need 2 to 1 in this room to cut in order to preserve 90. John, I wanted to get your thoughts, just again, your Gastech and all of the political actors that are there from the EastMed and elsewhere, where will they sort of square the circle, in the sense that Europe has an energy security crisis, they want gas, but they still want their energy transition, so they're not willing to give the EastMed people a 20-year guarantee, or even Qatar a 20-year guarantee on purchasing their gas. How do you see that circle being squared, and does this offer any breakthroughs this week, do you think?
Well, I think we've come full circle in our conversation. I started our discussion here looking at the current landscape. Could you ever imagine a discussion on a Sunday morning in the autumn that had the major artery of gas coming into Europe closed, and we don't know when it's going to reopen, a G7 effort to put a price cap on Russian exports, and at the same time, gas prices surging 500% to 600% over a year, and then having a sharp downfall, and not knowing what the future looks like here in terms of supplies coming from Russia, but demand for that gas with inflation so high. So this is a very complex window in time. And as you said, Sean, it's a very difficult time for planners of hydrocarbons. Now, gas is a transition fuel. It's defined by many as a fuel, but can you plan for the next 20 or 30 years? That's the sort of clarity you need from the Eastern Mediterranean basin to supply into Europe. One thing is for sure, though, after the shock of Russia-Ukraine, the overdependency on Germany, the Eastern Mediterranean will come to the fore as a vital top 3 issue around the European Union in terms of energy security and balancing the energy transition. It's not going to be solving the problem in the next 2 to 3 years, but I think it's fair to say that you need to counterbalance that overdependency that we were lulled into with Russia as a G8 member and supplying in that relationship with Germany for the last couple of decades. I think that's going to be changing, and they need to balance their supply scenario. The other languages coming up here, there's a lot of attendees in the Developing World Roundtable coming to the fore as well. Going into COP27 and COP28, they're saying it has to be a just transition. Don't hold back our natural gas assets. We want to produce them, at least for ourselves, if not for export. So we reduce our dependency on handouts, and we can supply energy for ourselves. Still 500 million plus people in Africa that don't have access to energy. So they're not thinking about the energy transition. They're thinking about energy supplies and energy security for the future so they can grow. So there is a lot of complexity. I was suggesting for my opening remarks tonight, you know how Davos kind of sets the agenda every year when it comes to the economic landscape and the geopolitical landscape. Gastech setting the discussion when it comes to at least the gas supplies as kind of a major meeting point this year in Milan, where I'm sitting.
And you'll also have, as we all will, the outcome of the OPEC meeting to digest tomorrow, if indeed there is a surprise. A surprise you would think is they would cut. I suppose you can't rule anything out, and certainly the fact that it is actually raised that 2 weeks ago must bring it to the attention that it's possible at least sometime. We will know Tuesday morning when the US markets open up that this could be another week, early in the week, where we could certainly see a direction of travel. As Mike indicated, there are many factors, but the direction of travel has been downward over the last number of trading sessions, except Friday, a slight pause. Will that continue? We'll have to see. Thank you, Mike Muller. As always, tremendous to have your insights this early September. John, great to see you. Look forward to seeing you both in the desert soon, and safe travels. Thank you so much.